Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources to hopefully help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid. I'm here with a very special guest, not a stranger to our airways, Albert Fox Cahn. Albert is the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project's founder and executive director. He's a fellow at the Engelberg Center on Innovation, Law, and Policy at NYU School of Law and a member of NYU's Alliance for Public Interest Technology. Mr. Cahn received his JD cum laude from Harvard Law School, where he is also an editor of the Harvard Law and Review Policy Review, and his BA in Politics and Philosophy from Brandeis University. Welcome back, Albert, to Community and Technology.
Thank you so much for having me, Stuart.
Yeah, well, so much going on. I could not help but think about you and our recent conversations during the past week or so with all of the unrest and the insurrection going on down at the Capitol building, and looking at all those photos and then the video, and then looking at the coverage as the authorities sought to track down these folks. And I said, well, I'm sure Albert has some things to say about this. And, speaking with my wife, and she was so angry. I said, Lynn, there's two sides to this coin. We talked about the geofencing that we had talked about on the show before, wherein folks like Google in particular can capture all of the devices in a given area and in a given time frame as one of the tools that law enforcement could potentially use to identify those perpetrators. So I'm just wondering, what your reaction was. I know one of the emotional reaction that I'm looking at my wife in particular, and I must say I shared somewhat as well. Let's get those guys.
Yeah.
But you got to temper that, and you got to use tools that are fair to folks. And as I've heard you say and read you say, we have to be careful with what tools we use because they can be turned on us. And you think, oh, okay, we can use them against the bad guys, but today's good guys are tomorrow's bad guys. So I'm just interested in your reaction to the insurrection and the surveillance and the various law enforcement techniques that you've seen operating since then.
Yeah, I think that captures attention so well because in the aftermath of the attack, like so many other people, my blood was boiling. I was so angry, and I was so angry on multiple levels. I was angry that these insurrectionists would attack the Capitol. I was furious at President Trump for inciting them and egging them on. And, even as the building was being attacked, even with people dead on the ground, he, had that second statement, which was, worse than doing nothing at all.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I was really scared because I know that a lot of other people were having that same anger. And I know that whenever we see a police failure like that, our natural impulse is, well, if the police didn't get the job done, if they couldn't protect the Capitol, clearly they need more powers, they need more tools. But as anyone who's ever gone to a protest at the Capitol knows, they had plenty of resources. They had plenty of officers. They had, agreements with area police departments and could have called on them. They could have had the National Guard. They could have used a small fraction of the force that they use at protesters of color every time they assemble at the Capitol. A small fraction of the force they've used against BLM protesters. A small fraction of the force they've used against anti-war protesters. And this wasn't a case of police officers who didn't have the power to keep the Capitol safe. This was a case of, police who are unwilling to use that power when the people breaking the law were white and were conservative. And right now we see this huge push to expand facial recognition and other powers in response. And I think it's really going to be a complete disaster.
Yeah, I'm old enough, Albert, to have been on the Capitol grounds back in the 60s when there were marches and protests and the National Guard was out for some of them. And there was not a way in heck that folks could have stormed any of those buildings. Snipers on the rooftops, I mean, and that was, 50 years ago I'm talking
Hmm.
about. And so today, and then the other thing that you didn't mention, I'm sure you will, is that the intelligence that uh, the law enforcement knew about had in their possession in advance of the event as to what might happen. So,
That's
they had all those tools.
That's completely right. We now know that the FBI had warned of exactly what was going to happen, days in advance. The Capitol Police's own intelligence division had a report 3 days before that laid out exactly what eventually did happen. They warned about the exact scenario that unfolded. But this wasn't something that was surreptitious. People were selling T-shirts that said "Civil War, Washington D.C., January 6th." This was
Mm,
something that people were advertising to the world,
mm-hmm,
and so they were on notice.
mm-hmm,
They knew what was coming. They simply turned a blind eye, and while there were some officers that really put themselves in harm's way to protect the lawmaker, there were others that put on MAGA hats and
mm-hmm,
took selfies and turned around and really helped the people who were attacking our capital.
mm-hmm. Dave Burstein just joined us, Albert. I want to introduce you to Dave Burstein, Albert Fox
Hi,
Cahn. Well,
how's my mic working?
you sound a little muted, Dave, a little fuzzy.
Okay,
Um,
I'll work
okay.
on here.
Um, okay, great. So, uh, um, Albert, you mentioned the flip side about, when we see the failures of law enforcement, even though they were perhaps for the wrong reasons, our adrenaline gets going, and yeah, let's give the authorities whatever they need to get after these guys. That's just kind of, I know that was my emotional reaction. Yeah, we got to get these guys, and even not just the perpetrators of the insurrection, but the whole white nationalist movement,
Yeah.
which has been out there for decades. I can remember back when back in the '60s, seeing the Ku Klux Klan march in streets, and I mean, so they've been around. They haven't gone anywhere. I mean, they've been around 100 and some years, since post World War II, since Reconstruction, and they went underground. I guess it was not politically correct.
Mhm.
And when Trump came into office, we had Charlottesville, we had the marches out in the open. I mean, just unbelievable. I didn't think we would ever see anything like that in this country. Folks marching with swastikas and crosses, and I mean, unreal. So that just kind of was a window into what was already there in my mind. It just kind of came to the surface. What are your thoughts about how we can begin to root that out? I mean, is it law enforcement? Is it education? Is it social policy? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's as someone who does a lot of work in the national security space, it's not a surprise to me to see violence coming from right-wing extremists, from white supremacists. After all, since 9/11, they have been the leading cause of political violence in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
We often see this narrative, these tropes on TV that create a highly racialized sense of who is a terrorist and where that threat comes from. But the truth is that it's oftentimes, more often than with any other demographic group, white nationalists and right-wing extremists.
Mm.
And you're going to be hearing in the coming days calls from DC for a new domestic terrorism statute, because under existing federal law, even though we have broad terrorism powers, those generally are inapplicable to individuals who are wholly domestic. And my real concern is that every time we've expanded police powers in response to right-wing extremists and white nationalists in the past, those powers have then been used to target communities of color. So a
Mm.
great example of this comes in the form of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, which we passed in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City attack. And in that case, it was another one of these right-wing extremists. He detonated a massive bomb killed dozens of people. It was a devastating attack, and in the aftermath, Congress passed this bill that was designed to, target that sort of threat. But in the years since, we've seen those expanded counterterrorism powers and the expedited death penalty authority used overwhelmingly to target communities of color. And in the recent days, in the waning days of the Trump administration, we saw that law exploited to kill, numerous people on federal death row, more people than had been killed in decades, overwhelmingly individuals of color, using an authority that, again, was created to target right-wing extremists. And I think that pattern is ripe to repeat itself here.
Wow, that's kind of frightening. I wasn't aware of that in terms of the death row and the actual execution of folks as a result of that anti-terrorism law. Wow. So I mean, how do we navigate through that? I mean, I'm thinking there needs to be some legislation on the books, something that empowers the FBI and enforcement authorities to go after these white supremacists. What is there a way to structure that so that it can't be turned against the very folks that the supremacists exploit?
I actually come away from this with a different answer, which is that we don't need more power for law enforcement. We need more oversight.
Mhm.
Because if we had law enforcement bodies that were actually held democratically accountable for the decisions they make, that are scrutinized for using force the way they did on the MLK holiday to target protesters of color with the same amount of scrutiny that they would get for targeting white conservative protesters, that if we had that actual robust bipartisan civilian oversight, we would see police that are willing to treat right-wing extremists as the threat that they are, because they would have to actually defend their judgments based off of evidence. But instead, what we've done is systematically disempower civilian oversight, deferring to police, letting police police themselves when it comes to a lot of these policy choices. And the result is that they are constantly creating these ideological blind spots for conservative movements that are supposedly pro-police, even as they're using Blue Lives Matter flags to physically assault officers.
So civilian oversight, public oversight, you think is the solution? I guess we have very little of that. I think there's been some movement in New York City in that regard. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on here in New York?
Yeah, so there's been years and years of work pushing back against the way we systematically yielded power to the NYPD, and this is something that I've been protesting since I was a teenager, even younger than that, in the city, targeting NYPD abuses. And some of these battles have been going on that long. Recently, what we've seen is the introduction of a disciplinary matrix, which provides greater guidance on when officers are going to face discipline. It's not perfect. It's far from perfect, but it's at least somewhat of a step in the right direction. We saw the passage of 50A, or rather the repeal of 50A. This was a loophole that was exploited by the de Blasio administration, the NYPD, to block the release of officers' disciplinary files. And this was something that basically the mayor made up as a justification for blocking transparency, and it took a statewide legislative campaign. But we were able last year, incredible work from Communities Unite for Police Reform and numerous activist groups, they were able to get that through. Unfortunately, there's ongoing litigation, and the city is now using that as an excuse to not comply with the law. But we're hoping that will resolve quickly. And then there's the bill that I've probably invested more time in than any other, and that's the Public Oversight Surveillance Technology Act, the POST Act, which we talked about last time I was on, which would require the NYPD to disclose every single spy tool it uses and to draft a privacy and use policy governing that. And, we were surprised, but the NYPD actually complied with the law. They just released on in middle of January, reports on all of these different systems. And right now, if you go to the NYPD website under the draft policies page, you can look at all of these policies, you can read what they say, and you can comment. And now the NYPD has to listen to what those comments are. And if they disregard them, we and many others will sue them. And so that's something where we think there's a really, important, opportunity, even though it's a small step, to push for more and more of this civilian oversight.
Mm-hmm. Now, is that actually a law or a regulation now, Albert? I read something about a comment period. What is that about?
Yeah, so the law was signed into the bill was signed into law by Mayor de Blasio in last July, and so under the comment period now, under the law, the NYPD had to release these policies, and now they have to listen to what the public has to say, and so they have to read each of the comments that's submitted. And if they ignore those comments, they are doing it at their peril. If they ignore the public feedback, then it could open them up to additional litigation, and it could be a new way to sue to block some of these technologies from being used.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is an example of public oversight of some of the technology surveillance tools that NYPD is using. I imagine there's some other public oversight that you would advocate to help reform and keep police honest. Can you talk about how, what that might look like, particularly in light of the whole white supremacist threat that now is so urgently in front of everyone?
Yeah, I think police discipline is really important for restoring community trust. That, when you have a system like the one we have in New York, where police officers, you can have essentially this entire, pseudo trial. It's like you go in, it's not a real court, it's not a real judge, it's a hearing officer. And you can go through all of that. You can spend days on it. At the end, it doesn't mean anything because it's completely up to the police commissioner.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have these outside agencies like the Civilian Complaint Review Board and the Office of the Inspector General for the NYPD, and they have no power to actually discipline officers when they violate the law or break the rules. And we see an expanded push in the aftermath of the way police broke the law repeatedly during last summer's protests, that to actually push back for more NYPD oversight. And I think this is crucial because I think the NYPD patterns that lead to violence towards BLM protests, including many people who were attacked simply for exercising their First Amendment rights, who broke no law, who were completely within their rights, and yet they were still brutalized, they were still arrested, they were still mistreated. The same impunity that enables the NYPD to get away with that, it also enables the mindset that has them and countless other police departments turn a blind eye to white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And we have to acknowledge the fact that there are more than a dozen off-duty officers who have been identified as part of the attack on the Capitol. Mm-hmm. Police were part of this attack, and we still don't know the full extent of it. We still don't know if there were NYPD officers, but we have a really damning history in the city of police turning violent against people who try to hold them accountable. I mean, I'm thinking of Rudy Giuliani's just notorious and racist march against the David Dinkins City Hall, where he led a drunken mob of off-duty officers to attack our city hall in a moment that really it has chilling similarities to what we saw at the Capitol. And so I think this is all really deeply interconnected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Albert Fox Cahn, who is the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, or STOP. And you're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. I'm reminded as you talk about just how endemic the racist white supremacy mindset is, even in police departments, not just in New York, but in many cities across the country. I'm reminded, and just have to remind our listeners, that local police evolved in this country um, in a large measure to control slaves or ex-slaves or enslaved is the proper term I've learned from my wife, who's an historian. And that often the first jails were basements in under pubs and bars where I'm going to say police, they weren't really even police, but were white men contained and corralled Black folks who were trying to escape, or Black folks that they just captured, and that these were the very early police forces in many cities across the country. They were essentially slave catchers, and the police departments have evolved from that. So I guess we should not be surprised at that mentality that Black and brown people are the bad guys. They're the enemies. They're the criminals. They're the ones that we are assigned to go after. And I'm just wondering, you talked a little bit about New York City and some of the possible legislation and regulation. How do we attack this on a broader level? Because policing, if I'm not mistaken, is pretty much a local concern. I'm not sure that the feds can. What can the feds do? What can this new administration do to lay down some guidelines, some rules for local law enforcement that might help root out this problem? Do you see any way through that from the federal level?
Yeah, and I definitely want to acknowledge the history you described of just the really horrific history of policing in America, its link to slave patrols, and just the effective deputization of any white person to use force on behalf of the state against African Americans and indigenous people at that time. And so yeah, here in the US, we have a long way to go if we were going to have anything resembling an ethical and effective police force, which is why so many rightfully call for defunding and abolishing the police. But with the federal government, with the new Biden administration, they have several powerful carrots and sticks, even though the police departments are overwhelmingly local. And in the United States, we have over 1,800 police departments. So
Wow.
just think of how many different departments and officials and policies that involves. But so in terms of the carrots, the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security provide large sums of money to local departments. Oftentimes, it's a huge part of their budget that comes through things like the Justice Assistant Grants, the Byrne Discretionary Grant Program. These are programs that departments often depend upon to keep the lights on. And so if you have a lot of discretion as a federal official on making that funding contingent on certain reforms, certain practices, and certain levels of oversight. On the stick side, you have a really strong history of the Department of Justice using federal consent decrees, which are court-enforced settlements, to actually impose judicial oversight of police departments. So that means it can be like a civilian monitor, a individual who their job is to track police actions day to day. It can mean that they agree to institute certain policies or certain procedures. But we saw this most recently, not at the federal level, but at the state level here in New York, from our own Attorney General Tish James, who filed a federal civil rights action against the NYPD, seeking a external monitor and a number of reforms in response to the protests and the way they were policed last summer.
Hmm. Okay. So this is WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. We're here speaking with Albert Fox Cahn, who is the executive director of Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, or STOP. And we're talking about white supremacy in light of the recent insurrection at the Capitol building, and police oversight, police monitoring, and how we might begin to rein some of the police activity in without infringing upon the rights of others. And we also have Dave Burstein here. Dave, would you like to comment? Hi, Dave.
I, I am less of an expert than our guest, and I don't have particular expertise. I did once upon a time campaign for a civilian complaint review board, and so I've been there for this kind of thing. But I don't have simple answers. Well, let me throw one out at you because we got a mayoral campaign. I know Maya Wiley has been very strong on this kind of issue. What have you heard from the other candidates?
So, for those of you who have not had the misfortune of trying to track the current mayoral campaign season, it is at times a clown car of candidates. I believe 17 were at the recent Brooklyn Candidates Forum, and you see everything from, people who have written absolutely nothing about policing to people who have paid lip service to these issues to people who have fairly comprehensive plans. Maya Wiley previously served as the chair of the Civilian Complaint Review Board and is a civil rights lawyer. We honestly have not been wowed by any of the candidates so far. And I should say that, my organization, STOP, is a 501c3. We don't endorse candidates. We don't campaign for candidates. And I'm going to be doing some work to try to educate candidates in the coming weeks and try to do scorecards and things like that. There have been some really disappointing policies. So Eric Adams, for example, has repeatedly said that he will carry a gun with him everywhere he goes as mayor, something which I think is completely inconsistent with the values of the office. He said he wouldn't need bodyguards because he would have his own firearm, and that's something that on a policing level I found very problematic. And we saw Andrew Yang launch his campaign platform, his campaign effort without any real policing platform. He had less than a page on his website devoted to the issue as a placeholder. And so maybe there will be a more substantive contribution coming in the future days, but I haven't seen that from him.
Let me bring us back to technology because that is a key focus here. The reason I'm following Maya Wiley is she, working for the Bloomberg administration, jumped into the federal FCC rules. The telcos were trying to get the permit, in fact, got the permission to use the spectrum everybody uses for Wi-Fi. And in fact, they're doing that fairly heavily in the cities. And a lot of the Wi-Fi spectrum is now being used by Verizon and AT&T in a few cities. And I was really impressed because she had probably the best filing at the FCC on the subject. So I don't know her beyond that, but she strikes me as somebody, if she said she's going to work on something, who does, which is not an endorsement, although I might have endorsed her off the air. What else are you seeing that we should know here in New York?
Well, here in New York, one of the things that has been most problematic in recent years has been facial recognition. We have one of the larger facial recognition programs in the United States. We've used it more than 22,000 times in the prior 3 years. We use it overwhelmingly against communities of color. We use it, disproportionately for minor offenses. It's a really alarming and just unregulated aspect of policing. And it never is something that it's never evaluated by a judge, because what happens is they will use facial recognition, identify a photo, and then show it to a witness, show it to someone else involved in the case, and they'll say, "Is this the guy?" And if someone says yes, they'll never mention facial recognition in the indictment. They'll never mention it at trial. And so the entire case sometimes can hinge on witness identifications that are tainted by facial recognition. So we want New York to join the growing number of cities and states that have actually outlawed facial recognition technology for government use. And we strongly believe that with beginning with law enforcement, but then eventually with every aspect of our government, it should be completely and categorically banned. This is something we helped to do with K-12 schools last year. The governor signed a bill that we helped boost that banned facial recognition for K-12 education. But that's only a 2.5-year moratorium, and more is needed to make that a permanent ban.
I saw something on your site about facial recognition or biometrics in libraries. What's going on with that in New York?
Yeah, so this was a really a disappointing example of this technology run amok. So, the New York Public Library, which I have to say, I'm currently a Brooklyn Public Library guy, but I grew up in the New York Public Library system. I'm a huge fan. They've always been very committed to, privacy and protecting their patrons, but they started deploying a type of device we've seen a lot during the pandemic, a thermal imaging scanner with facial detection software. And so this was something that we were alarmed by because, a lot of these sort of COVID-19 kiosks that have popped up, they really don't have any evidence that they work. They're not FDA approved. They're not peer reviewed. They're basically just pseudoscience. They're designed to create the illusion of being protected from COVID, but at the same time, they have higher error rates for communities of color, and they potentially can collect really invasive biometric data. And so we reached out to the library and basically made it clear that we thought they should not be using this technology. And that's ongoing. We're hoping to have discussions with them and to pull this back. But really, we've seen all of these public spaces which are now under new layers of surveillance and monitoring because of COVID-19. And it would be one thing if that was actually technology that was help keeping us safe from this incredibly devastating pandemic. But it's another thing when it's, really unproven and sometimes disproven forms of tracking technology.
Wow.
I'm going to sign off just because, as you can hear, I'm a little bit hoarse, but I'm doing very well. I'm glad to be back.
Well,
so tell them about Marty Cooper for next week, because he's special.
okay. Well, thank you, Dave. Thanks for joining in. So, Al, I wanted to, while you're talking about the New York City, I also saw something about biometric privacy law related to commercial establishments. What is that about?
So there are two biometric privacy laws that we've been working on. So one is a bill that was actually the last bill sponsored by Richie Torres that got signed into law before he became a member of Congress. It's a bill that bans a number of commercial establishments from capturing your biometric information when you come in and transferring it to a third party. I don't believe the law has come into effect yet, or if it has, only in the recent days. And so we're waiting to see how far it goes. But, while it's not the strongest law, we do think it's an important measure in pushing back against some of the surreptitious ways in which our faces are tracked, our irises are scanned, and our biometric data is aggregated by places just because we go in to buy a soda. And so this could be a new way to sue a lot of those companies if they go beyond what's permitted. And it's also going to require them to disclose how they're tracking us as well. On top of that, another thing we are excited about is a state bill. The Richie Torres bill is at the city level. The state bill is called the Biometric Information Privacy Act, or BIPA. And it's a copy of a really important Illinois law that has been in place for over a decade and effectively made Illinois the only state in the United States where you have meaningful biometric privacy. Under that bill, anyone who uses biometric information without clear consent, anyone, they are on the they are not just subject to the usual slap on the wrist stuff. They're actually subject to really severe fines. It's $5,000 per violation. And
break that down for us, Albert. What is a biometric surveillance, just for the folks who may not know?
Oh yeah, sorry for the jargon. So biometric surveillance is anything that tries to figure out who we are, what our identity is, our name, our social security number, everything, from a biological feature. So facial recognition is the most common one. Fingerprinting is another version of it. Iris scanning is another version. But there's so many more forms of biometric tracking that use other parts of our body. Someone has machine learning that they've set up to try to do elbow detection. There are people who have ear detection. There are people who do gait detection, which tries to identify people simply based off of how they walk. The pace and the length of your stride. So if there's a part of your body, there is someone out there trying to use that to identify who you are.
Wow, that's biometric surveillance.
Yep, that's biometric surveillance. And so all of that, it's incredibly dangerous because when you're tracking us, not because what we do, but because of who we are, it's immutable. It's something that we can't escape. And you can't change your face, you can't change your fingerprints, and you can. If someone's tracking your phone, you can always leave your phone behind. If someone's tracking your email, you can always use a new email account, but you can't get a new face. And so that's part of why biometric surveillance is so dangerous and so invasive, and why there's such a push to block it. And companies are violating this all the time and being sued for it. So Facebook had to pony up nearly $1 billion because they were taking people's faces and scanning them and using it to train algorithms to better identify people.
Wow.
They were taking the photos from our Facebook accounts. We've seen people being targeted because of these profiteering surveillance startups like Clearview AI, which took millions and millions of photos on nearly every American from the internet and built up a surveillance tool where police officers can use facial recognition from their phone without any oversight. And so they're now in court being sued by the ACLU. So that's something that, we're glad it exists in Illinois, but there's no reason why only people in Chicago should have, privacy rights. New Yorkers should have the same protections that they have.
Now, how does this biometric surveillance dovetail into what's happening with the whole COVID response? And I'm sure there's some issues there regarding surveillance and tracking of folks.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of issues with COVID-19 data privacy because, one of the most important tools we have in fighting the pandemic is contact tracing. So, historically, contact tracing meant that a person would get on a phone call and they would have an interview and they would ask you, one-on-one, about anyone you potentially exposed in the prior days, anyone you put at risk for COVID-19. But we've seen during this pandemic a new type of contact tracing, these highly invasive apps that, there's one from Citizen, there are a bunch of other, there are a bunch of for-profit ones, there's one from the state that has some more privacy protections. And they're gathering tons of data, but what we realized was there was nothing to prevent the NYPD or ICE from coming in and taking that data and using the public health data, the COVID-19 contact tracing data,
Mhm.
to try to arrest people or deport people. So we worked with a large coalition to enact the first COVID-19 privacy law in the country, and actually say that you cannot use that contact tracing data, including biometric data, for any other purpose than combating the pandemic.
Wow. But I mean, I guess I'm a little nervous that though you can kind of circumscribe how the data can be used, but you're still collecting the data. And as we know, these data collections can be hacked, and all kinds of nefarious stuff have happened with data sets, and that many of these big media companies have maintained. Um, are you at all concerned that just the collection of all this data, and it's not just the U.S., it's global, as around COVID, are you at all concerned that this whole data collection could lead us down a slippery slope?
It varies depending on the data. So I think with the contact tracing data, there, I think the protections are so strong in New York, and the risk is so small as a result, that it's so important to actually make sure that we support that contact tracing and fight the pandemic. And
Hmm.
one of the parts of the law that I think you would appreciate is there's actually mandatory data deletion after 14 days.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're not just saying that you can't share this data and you get to warehouse it and wait for the next big hack, but no, you actually have to delete this data as you go through.
Hmm.
One thing that has concerned me that is up and coming, though, and similar, is vaccine passports,
Hmm.
because we've seen some, historically, if you wanted to fly overseas, depending on the country you're going to, you would have to show a vaccine, a yellow card, a yellow piece of paper that had proof of immunization, and it was required as a condition for entry. And, that's been a system that's worked fairly well. It's not perfect. But what we've seen in the aftermath of the pandemic is that, well, not aftermath, it's still raging, but during this pandemic, is people want to not only digitize that, replacing that with a phone-based tracking app, but they want to go a step further, and they want to actually say that for COVID-19, that you should have to use this app just to go to work or to go to
Mm.
school or to even go to the grocery store. And so I'm very concerned that, this sort of everyday vaccine passport is going to be built up. And it's not, and it's something which, the doctors haven't asked for it. It's not evidence-based. It's not a public health need, but it is a way for these surveillance firms to make, their products even more a part of our life.
Hmm. Now that raises another corollary question for me. I've heard about some apps that will alert you when you come in contact with someone who may be infected or who hasn't been tested, or various status regarding COVID. You get an alert on your phone as you come in contact with those folks. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, so that those are the contact tracing apps that I was mentioning.
Okay.
So they can also be called exposure notification systems. The largest one here in New York is called COVID Alert NY. And so my concern with the apps is they just really don't work well.
Mm.
First of all, so New York, I think they boasted over 1 million downloads in the first 2 months, but in that same period they had fewer than 1,000 possible exposures recorded in that entire 2-month period. And so, what you're seeing is that, these apps aren't capable of tracking in real time the sort of way that COVID is spreading. Because, 1,000 sounds like a lot, but, that's 2 months, 500 people a month. We know that, some days, that many people are getting COVID-19 in New York in an hour. It's really deeply disturbing. So they don't work. There are the privacy issues as well, and just they also they are potentially discriminatory because in order to run them, you not only need a smartphone, but you often need one of the latest generation smartphones, and so this can create a really warped data set where decision makers are given this image that's skewed towards wealthier communities because those are the communities that are able to download and run those exposure apps.
I guess that's probably an overarching concern that I know we've talked about previously, and that is because you have a technology application that is making decisions and giving us information like facial recognition and tracking, etc., that we tend to presume that, oh, it's technological and therefore it's accurate and it's on the mark, and that's not really so, is it?
Yeah, I mean, this gets into the broader concerns with automated decision systems and artificial intelligence. So, automated decision systems is a really broad term. It means basically anytime you're automating something that a human being normally would do. And artificial intelligence, I mean, we see it in movies. It looks super, futuristic, but really it's pretty old-fashioned math. You know, most artificial intelligence, most machine learning, it's a type of linear algebra that's been around since the 60s. It's something that it's gotten a lot cheaper to do, but the underlying techniques haven't changed that much in day-to-day practice. And so using these technologies, oftentimes what we're doing is teaching systems to crudely replicate what we're able to do. They aren't doing something a lot better. They sometimes can do it faster, but we're basically trying to teach them to replicate human decisions. But oftentimes in the process, we're teaching them to be biased, and at times we're teaching them to be even more biased than human decision makers. So in one case with Project Midas up in Michigan, they used artificial intelligence to evaluate benefits fraud and whether people were committing fraud when they were asking for public assistance. Thousands of people were flagged. People lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they lost everything. And over 90% of the benefits fraud cases that the artificial intelligence flagged, it was wrong. Wow. It was flat out wrong. Over the summer, we saw people taking to the streets in the UK because there in the UK they had this thing called the A levels. It's like their equivalent of advanced placement class plus the SAT all in one. It's the most important test to figure out if you're going to go to college or where you can go. And they decided that, with COVID, we're going to see a lot of grade inflation. So we need to use an algorithm to be objective. Well, the algorithm, the way it decided to make things quote unquote objective was to essentially punish schools with poor students and schools where they had a poor history of getting kids into, top universities. And they said, well, if your grades went up this year, that's not evidence that you did a good job. That's not evidence that, your teachers did extraordinary things in the middle of pandemic. That's proof that you are inflating your grades, and we're going to punish you and your kids by reducing the grades.
Wow.
And so you had kids who were like on track to go to, Cambridge and Oxford and, all these incredible schools, and they were basically being told that they would have to go to, community college. And it's just like it's really disgraceful. But and it's not just sort of things like, standardized tests. We even see it with who gets prioritized for COVID vaccine. Stanford used artificial intelligence. They used it to decide who should be a priority. And lo and behold, the way that it all came out, they prioritized all the wealthy, experienced faculty members and ignored all the younger resident doctors.
Wow.
And skipped them over, even though they were the ones on the front line treating patients every day.
Wow, that is so incredible, Albert. I mean, that, we have all these systems and all this technology, and yet we build in so much bias that they make these crazy poor decisions, and yet we infuse them with so much power that we think, when I say we, I'm talking about kind of the general public, we think that, oh, well, technology is neutral. It's not biased. The computer made the decision, and that's just so wrong. I mean, it's just total inverse.
And it's such magical thinking, it's so easy to believe the sales hype. You have someone from Silicon Valley, from a place that does like really cool things on our phone day to day, and they say they can solve some new problem. But like, just because a company is good at finding, new ways for us to buy sweatpants or to, chat with college friends, that doesn't mean that they're good at building essential municipal infrastructure. It doesn't mean they're good at figuring out how to end a pandemic. And, the cautionary tale here is that every single time we've seen, the tech firms jump into these major public policy debates by saying that their systems are the solution, more often than not, they're making things worse.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, we're speaking with Albert Fox Cahn, the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. And Albert, we're just about out of time. And in the last couple of minutes, what would you like to leave our audience with that maybe we haven't touched on, or you'd like to further expound on?
Yeah, I think one of the things I always like to mention is, with all of these debates, especially when they're at the federal level, navigating Congress is hard, getting things through. It takes so much work from so many people, but it's so much more accessible when you're dealing with, your local city council member, with your state senator, with your assembly member. And if you talk to them about these issues, they will listen more often than not. Their jobs are to be accessible to communities. And so we work with groups all across the city and the state to engage with legislators around this. And if you don't like the sound of the facial recognition technology that the NYPD is using, tell your lawmaker. If you don't like the idea of these highly invasive biometric tools, tell them. If you don't want to continue to see an unaccountable NYPD without civilian oversight, without actual accountability for officers who break the law and violate the patrol guide, these are things that they need to hear, and they need to hear them constantly, because they're constantly hearing from lobbyists. They're constantly being bombarded with competing information. But if they are hearing consistently and persuasively from their constituents that these issues should be top of mind, they will respond. And we definitely think that this is a year when New York can take a leadership role in a lot of these issues, including a complete ban on facial recognition for police, including a ban on geofence warrants and geolocation data. And so those are things, if people want to learn more, we've got policy briefs. I swear there's not much legalese in them at stopspying.org. And we're always looking to connect with more people who want to support the fight for a better, more equitable, and more private New York.
Well, thank you so much for that. We've been speaking with Albert Fox Cahn of Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. Website is, again, Albert?
www.stopspying.org.
Okay, thanks so much. So as Albert said, it's time to speak up and speak out. So thanks for tuning in, and thank you, Albert Fox Cahn, for being on Community and Technology. Been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, Stuart.
Okay, thank you. This has been Community and Technology, WHCR 90.3 FM. Stay tuned for more community-based programming. Thanks for tuning in.